Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Did I Stutter, posted by Amogus Devilman, and that's cross-post from the Ron Paul subreddit. And then it looks like a question: which gun control laws do you consider infringements? And it says me. It's a picture of some laughing hyena dog thing, and it's smoking like a cigarette. Looks like, and they says all of them. And yeah, personally, I would agree with that. Ultimately, the Second Amendment says shall not be infringed. So all gun control laws are infringement. If the state wants to take your guns away, ultimately the state can justify doing whatever it wants to. But ultimately, that's I would say that's against the Constitution and Bill of Rights. But the U.S. government has countlessly found ways around the Constitution and Bill of Rights whenever it's necessary. So I think that's important to remember as well, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump's mercurial, constantly changing import taxes took American businesses on a wild ride from Reason.com, posted by Johnny Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump's tariffs, but ultimately, he can implement whatever taxes or tariffs he wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing he can do about it because a lot of people will always defer to what the president says in matter of law, and I personally don't really care for it, but that's the way it is sometimes. Next, we have the cameras will keep pulling back as Trump deteriorates. I cropped this so you can better see how his face looks. This is his speech saying we can't afford childcare, Medicaid, Medicare for U.S. citizens, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosspost from the Trump virus subreddit. And yeah, personally, I do think Trump's kind of deteriorating. He is nearing 80. But the same people who are going on and on about Trump deteriorating right now are a lot of the same people who made any excuses in regards to Biden deteriorating and went back during his term. And it just goes to show you, if Trump had a D next to his name, they'd be defending everything and anything he did. But since he has an R next to his name, he has to be the worst president ever. And it just goes to show you, they don't have any values. They only have teams. They just will go with whatever the narrative says. That they made excuses for Joe Biden's senility until they couldn't anymore. And meanwhile they constantly go after Trump for I would argue his senility isn't as bad as Biden's was. And even though I would still say it's pretty bad, but that's my thoughts there. Next, we have justices reject Colorado law banning conversion therapy for LGBTQ minors. The law represented an egregious assault on free speech. From NYTimes.com, hosted by Lemon Limelight, and they added, the Supreme Court on Tuesday overwhelmingly decided for Christian therapists, rejecting a Colorado law that prohibited mental health professionals from trying to change the sexual orientation or gender identity of LGBTQ minors. Critics and major medical organizations say such therapy is ineffective and potentially dangerous for young people, but it's 8-1 decision. The court said the law, as applied to talk therapy, represented an egregious assault on free speech and the First Amendment. And yeah, I personally would agree with that. I personally don't know how effective conversion therapy is, but I think it's interesting. A lot of the people who are against this law are the same people who are either silent on or for all the stuff that's marketing as gender affirming care. And it just goes to show you, when it comes to liberty, especially parents' liberty, when people are going to support things that they support, while saying anything that goes against their narrative should be illegal. And ultimately, I think libertarian positions, you got to support parents' rights, whether it's from a woke progressive standpoint or a more MAGA conservative standpoint. And yeah, personally, I would say that, if you want to do conversion therapy, if you're a minor and it's voluntary, I think you should be able to. Same if you're an adult. Ultimately, I would say, justify whatever you want to justify. You want to do conversion therapy and it's voluntary, you should be able to. Ultimately, if everything's voluntary, you should be able to do it, I would say. With that being said, there are some things I would say that minors can't consent to, like, sex. But ultimately, I do think, consent is the biggest thing when it comes to a lot of stuff like conversion therapy or gender affirming care. It's got to be consensual. You could argue that the minors might not be able to consent to either or of those, but ultimately, people are going to justify what they want to justify based on whatever economic or social capital they have in any given moment, and that's very much what life is a lot of the time. So that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Trump says it's not possible for the U.S. to pay for Medicaid, Medicare, and daycare. We're fighting wars from NBCNews.com, hosted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I think, I don't really care for Medicaid, Medicare, and daycare, but I'd definitely rather the U.S. be paying for those than fighting wars overseas. But ultimately, the government can throw money whatever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Sadly, a lot of it does go to war, and I think it was interesting. Trump marketed himself as a no new wars candidate, and he's just going to get us into wars just like all the previous presidents did. And it just goes to show you, the politicians will say one thing on the campaign trail, and they'll get in office and do the exact opposite. Ultimately, the Uniparty, they'll like Obama and Trump will say no new wars on the campaign trail, and then they'll get us into wars like Obama did for Libya and Trump did for Iran. But so it's just going to show you that it doesn't really matter. Politics is mostly just theater. The deep state always wins in the end, really, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have infographic, who really pays for tariffs. These scholars tracked a bottle of wine to find out, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, I personally do think the consumer pays most for the tariffs, especially if they want to pay for something that's a foreign good. They're the ones paying for it with the extra tariff on it, and I think that's very anti-libertarian. I think the libertarian position is you need a free market. If a good can be produced for cheaper overseas and shipped over here for cheaper than a local good, ultimately the free market says you should be able to get that good for whatever price it is without the government putting an extra tax or tariff on it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have exclusive Russia ran disinfo campaign to discredit Javier Milei from OpenDemocracy.net, posted by Socialist or Morons, and they added, seems like there were many victims of this disinfo campaign on this sub. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for disinformation campaigns, be they run by Russia, China, or the U.S. or private actors. But ultimately, people are going to say whatever they want to say. A lot of people just use Russia as an excuse to why people don't agree with them. It's like the Democrats. They said, "Oh, Russia rigged the 2016 election." And, ultimately, there might have been some Russian astroturfing on social media. There's all kinds of astroturfing on social media. But, you just can't blame Russia for all your problems. It's a lot like in the South Park movie where the parents say, Canada's responsible for all our children's problems. Well, in reality, they're much more responsible. But, when you just want to always find someone else to blame rather than blaming yourself as to why people don't agree with you and your ideas. It must be a Russian disinformation campaign or a Chinese disinformation campaign, etc., etc. Next, we have the Republican plan to nationalize elections is performative nonsense from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is we shouldn't have elections in the first place. Democracy is inherently anti-liberty and inherently forced collectivism when done on a national or a scale, I would say. But ultimately, the government can run elections however it feels like, and if you don't like it, well, that's ultimately gonna you just have to cope with it sometimes, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Hexif fires U.S. Army Chief of Staff, others, and the chaplain. Military soldiers complain, told that the U.S. is fighting Iran to cause Armageddon. Biblical End Times from AlJazeera.com, posted by Apollo Delphi, and that's a cross-post from the Live News 24H subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately the U.S. government can fire whoever they want to fire, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's how the government works. They're going to justify what they want to justify, and they're in a position of authority to get it done. Next, we have White House requests giant $1.5 trillion defense budget amid Iran war from Yahoo.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. should be throwing $1.5 trillion at its military, but ultimately, it can throw as much money at its military at once, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's why in my ideal system, taxation would be voluntary. If people want to throw money at the military, they should be able to. If they want to throw money at, like, Medicare, Medicaid, they should be able to. I think, people want to throw tax whatever they spend whatever they want to. If they don't want to pay taxes at all, they shouldn't be forced to do so. I think that's very much how society should work. I think it's interesting. Consent is very important among people today. Yet taxation is constantly done without consent, and it's justified because the government is in the position of state authority to justify enforcing whatever it wants to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have White House requests giant $1.5 trillion defense budget amid Iran war from Yahoo.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's across posts from the Law subreddit. And I think we just talked about that one. So I guess we'll move on to the next post. Next, we have the 4 words Trump said to Bondi on way to SCOTUS hearing revealed from theindependent.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for what he said. Apparently, he said, I think it's time. And I think he just fired her recently, but I don't think it really matters. He'll just get another crony in there, and nothing will get done. And that's very much how government works. It's very much just a circle jerk of, the people who are in positions of, like, the attorney general and the cabinet and the president, I would say. They're all just really figureheads. The real power lies with the deep state, like the FBI, CIA, NSA, and what's happening behind the curtains, I would say. I would say the real most powerful people in the U.S. government are the people we don't hear about, the bureaucrats who are operating behind the curtain rather than those that are operating in front of it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump requests $1.5 trillion for military spending from NYTimes.com, posted by Jody Porcupine. They added, with the United States warfare and world conflicts around the world, the White House asked Congress on Friday to approve about $1.5 trillion for defense in the 2027 fiscal year. If enacted, the amount would set military spending at its highest level in modern history. The request, which arrives as part of President Trump's new budget, would amount to a roughly 40% increase from what the United States spent on the Pentagon this fiscal year. And yeah, personally, as I said with the last post on this, I don't really care for it, but ultimately the U.S. government can throw money at whatever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Trump calls for $1.5 trillion military budget is irresponsible, wasteful, and unrealistic from Reason.com, posted by Jay Porcupine. And yeah, I would agree with all that, but ultimately, ultimately the U.S. government's going to throw whatever it wants, money at whatever it wants to, and there's oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have There's Always a Tweet posted by Jay Porcupine. That looks like a tweet from Donald Trump from October 9, 2019. The United States has spent $8 trillion fighting and policing the Middle East. But thousands of our great soldiers have died or been badly wounded. Millions of people have died on the other side. Going into the Middle East is the worst decision ever made. And yes, I would agree with Trump there. I'm sad that he went against that. It's interesting. A lot of times he'll say one thing and then do the opposite. It's just very much how politics works. It's just stab you when you're not stabbing you in the front, they're stabbing you in the back. And yeah, I think it's interesting. Trump's built a huge portion of his brand on being anti-foreign interventionism, but then Israel came knocking and they said, oh, we gotta get into a forever war with Iran, and Trump was more than willing to bow down to them. And it just goes to show you that the special interests are really the ones running Washington, not Donald Trump. He's just a figurehead for them to distract from the fact that the special interests and deep state bureaucrats are the ones who are really running the show in Washington. Next, we have Trump's answer to Iran's Hormuz crisis, sell oil we don't have, from Reason.com, posted by Jay Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I do think the U.S. has more oil than a lot of people think it does, because, it does have access to all of Alaska's oil. Plus, I do think it has a lot of Venezuela's oil from, their kind of mini invasion they did back in January. But ultimately, if the U.S. wants to sell oil, I think it should be able to. I think we have probably more oil than a lot of people think we do. I don't know why we can't use more of it than when we have to keep getting it from the Strait of Hormuz. But, ultimately, people are going to justify whatever they want to justify, especially in regards to oil. Personally, I think the libertarian perspective is, ultimately, we should decentralize our from oil. I like how we have more electric cars and hybrids out there these days. The libertarian position should very much be against the centralization of the oil industry, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have I Live in Colorado, Conversion Therapy Destroyed My Life, from unclosetedmedia.com, posted by Knee Concussions, and they shared a bit of the story. At 12 years old, upon returning home from school, I saw my dad sitting in the living room. I immediately something was wrong. Come here, he said, with my computer in his lap. He proceeded to show me pictures of men kissing they had found in my search history. If you live this way, either you're going to kill yourself or someone's going to go out and kill you for it. He told me, and neither of those things matter because God will never love you again. I couldn't say anything. In our world, my dad was the one with the answers. He was the elder in our church, the second highest rule oriented for authority and the highest form of control. If he said it, it had to be true. For the next years, I pretended like my feelings weren't there. I feel like I was just waiting for the rest of my life to collapse. I knew being gay wasn't an option, so when I found conversion therapy at 15, it felt like the answer. I didn't know what would cause me to spend the next 7 years of my life undoing myself. And yeah, personally, I think that, it's interesting how a lot of LGBTQ journalists like this market conversion therapy is the worst thing ever. Yeah, I'm sure if this kid said, "Oh, I'm trans," and wanted all the gender affirming care and like all the gender surgeries, and it went on to regret it later, they would say, "Oh, sometimes people regret things later. That's how life is." People, as I said, they want what they want. A lot of the gay people, they want conversion therapy to be illegal, but they want gender affirming care to be legal. Well, a lot of the evangelical right wants the opposite. And just goes to show you, as I said earlier, people want liberty when they agree with it. But I would say it's true liberty is when people do things you don't want to do, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. People should have liberty to do whatever they want. I personally don't think you should be out in the streets stripping out on drugs all day. But I definitely do think the libertarian position is if you want to justify doing that, it's your body, your choice. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump warns he'll rain down hell on Iran within 48 hours unless trade reform routes is open and peace deals made. Posted 80 hours ago from independent.co.uk, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, Trump's a lot all bark and no bite sometimes. And ultimately, if he wants to rain down hell on Iran, I personally don't think the U.S. should be bombing the Middle East. But that's kind of been the default for the past couple decades. So a lot of people are making a big deal of this Iran war, but in reality, I don't think it's too big a deal in the long run because the U.S. is always bombing the Middle East. It's just that they're bombing a country that they don't usually bomb. It's just going to show you the U.S. government pretty much always has to be bombing somewhere with its military, and that's my thoughts there. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.